The world was a blur of noise and chaos. One moment, Donald Trump was soaring high above what he assumed were magnificent, tremendous mountains, and the next, a terrifying shudder ran through the helicopter. Metal groaned, alarms blared, and the pilot yelled things that were lost in the mechanical scream. The descent was violent and fast, a stomach-lurching spiral towards the green and brown patchwork below. Trees rushed up to meet them, their branches scratching at the windows like desperate fingers. The final impact was a deafening crunch, a jarring halt that threw him against his restraints. It was a very, very bad landing. The worst. When silence finally settled, thick and heavy, Trump unbuckled himself, his mind racing. Where was he? This didn't look like any part of America he knew. The air that seeped through the fractured door was warm and smelled of earth and something spicy. He pushed the mangled door open and stepped out, his pristine suit now smudged with dirt and grease. He looked around at the rugged landscape, the simple mud brick houses, and the towering, unfamiliar peaks in the distance. This was a real problem, a very big problem. He had to get back. He had important things to do, very important. He patted his pockets, searching for his phone. Nothing. It must have been lost in the crash, probably shattered into a million pieces. Terrific, he muttered to himself, brushing dust from his signature red tie. How was he supposed to call anyone? How would they even find him out here in the middle of nowhere? He saw figures emerging from the small houses, their colorful clothes a stark contrast to the dusty surroundings. They were walking towards him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. He stood a little taller, trying to project an air of command despite the circumstances. He was, after all, a very important person. As the small crowd drew closer, he saw men with long beards, women with their heads covered by beautiful scarves, and wide-eyed children who pointed at the wreckage. Men with long beards, women with their heads covered by beautiful scarves, wide-eyed children who pointed at the wreckage. They chattered amongst themselves in a language he couldn't understand, their voices a soft, melodic hum. An older man with a kind face and a long white beard stepped forward, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. He said something, a question perhaps, but the words were foreign. Alien. Trump just stared back, his confusion mounting. This was not going to be easy, not easy at all. He needed a translator, and he needed one now. The old man, whose name he would later learn was Babar, gestured for him to follow. With little choice and a growing sense of surreal detachment, Trump walked alongside him towards the center of the village. The villagers trailed behind, their whispers following him like a gentle breeze. He was led into a modest home, the cool interior a welcome relief from the sun's glare. Inside, he was offered a small wooden stool to sit on. A woman brought him a glass of water, her eyes kind but cautious. He drank it gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his dry throat. This was not Trump Tower, that was for sure. The hospitality, however, was first class. Babar sat opposite him, smiling patiently. He tried speaking again, slowly this time, pointing at himself and saying, "Babar." Then he pointed at Trump. "Donald," Trump replied, his voice raspy. "Donald Trump." He repeated it louder, as if the volume would somehow bridge the language gap. The villagers murmured the name Dun Al Trump, the sound strange and new on their tongues. A young boy giggled, and soon the whole room was filled with soft, good-natured laughter. Trump couldn't help but crack a small smile. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. They seemed like good people, nice people. Soon, a feast was laid out before him on a colorful cloth on the floor. There were steaming plates of rice, fragrant lentil stew, and freshly baked flatbread that smelled absolutely wonderful. He was used to well-done steaks and ketchup, but he was hungry. He watched as Babar tore a piece of bread, scooped up some lentils, and ate with his hands. Trump hesitated for a moment before following his lead. The food was incredible, truly fantastic. The flavors exploded in his mouth, a complex blend of spices he had never experienced before. "This is great," he announced to the room. "Really, really great." They couldn't understand his words, but they understood his enthusiastic eating and his clean plate. More food was offered, along with a sweet, milky tea called chai. He sipped it, finding it surprisingly comforting. He tried to explain who he was, using grand hand gestures. He made a shape like a big building with his hands for Trump Tower. Then mimed, signing papers for being president. The villagers watched, completely fascinated, but utterly bewildered. They just nodded and smiled, pouring him another cup of the delicious tea, assuming their strange guest was simply a very animated storyteller. The next day, the mission to establish contact with the outside world began in earnest. Trump, feeling refreshed after a surprisingly comfortable sleep on a woven cot, was determined to get a message out. He tried to explain the concept of a telephone to Babar. He held his hand to his ear and mouth, making ringing noises. "Ring, ring, hello, it's Trump," he'd say, looking at the village elder expectantly. Babar, ever patient, would just nod wisely and offer him a piece of sugarcane to chew on, perhaps thinking it was some kind of morning ritual for the strange red-tide man from the sky. It was a tremendous failure in communication. They walked through the village, with Trump pointing at anything that looked remotely technological. He pointed at a water pump, a sewing machine, and even a brightly painted tractor. "Phone? Internet? Wi-Fi?" he asked hopefully at each stop. The villagers would shake their heads, offering him things instead. A chicken, a handcrafted pair of sandals, a hat to shield him from the sun. He was accumulating a lot of gifts, which was very nice, but he wasn't getting any closer to making a call. He needed to get back to Mar-a-Lago, where the reception was always perfect. The best reception. The breakthrough, or what seemed like one, came when a young boy named Ali proudly showed Trump his most prized possession, an old battery-powered radio. Trump's eyes lit up. A radio, it was a start. He seized it, twisting the dial frantically. Static hissed and crackled, occasionally punctuated by snippets of music and voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize. He was looking for news, for a signal, for anything that sounded like America. Ali watched, concerned that the strange man might break his toy. He tried to show him how to find the station that played the best film music. But the radio was a dead end. The batteries were weak and the signal was weaker. It couldn't transmit, only receive, and poorly at that. Trump slumped in defeat, handing the radio back to the boy with a sigh. His grand plans were being thwarted by a simple lack of technology. He, a master of communication, of television, of rallies, was completely cut off. He looked at the faces around him, who were watching him with such genuine sympathy. They didn't have phones or internet, but they seemed happy. It was very interesting. Very, very interesting. Just when despair began to set in, Babar's daughter, a bright young woman named Samina, who had been watching the communication attempts with amusement, had an idea. She disappeared into her house and returned with a tattered English textbook from her school days. She couldn't speak the language well, but she could recognize some words. She flipped through the pages and pointed to a picture of a satellite dish. "Big city?" she asked, her pronunciation careful and slow. Trump's eyes widened. "Yes, big city, satellite, exactly." He nodded vigorously, a huge smile spreading across his face. She was a genius, a total genius. Samina explained, using a combination of broken English gestures and drawings in the dirt, that the nearest big city with such technology was a 2-day journey away by donkey. A donkey. He hadn't ridden a donkey before. He preferred golf carts, the best golf carts. But this was an emergency. He agreed immediately. The village sprang into action, preparing one of their sturdiest donkeys for the important journey. They packed supplies, water bread and dried apricots. Trump, feeling a bit like a character in an old movie, put on the gifted hat and prepared for his next unexpected adventure. The journey was long and bumpy. The donkey was not a Cadillac, but the scenery was truly spectacular, better than any postcard. He and his young guide, Ali, rode through breathtaking mountain passes and lush valleys. Ali would point out landmarks, and Trump would respond with a tremendous or beautiful, the only common ground they needed. He was starting to think this wasn't so bad. It was a real experience, something nobody would believe. He would tell everyone about it. It would be a great story for his next rally, the best story. Finally, on the afternoon of the second day, they crested a hill and saw it in the distance. A town, larger than the village, with metal roofs and, most importantly, a tall communications tower topped with a satellite dish. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He found a man who owned a satellite phone, and after a confusing but ultimately successful negotiation involving a crisp $100 bill he still had in his wallet, he finally made the call. "Get me the operator at Mar-a-Lago," he said into the receiver, his voice filled with relief. "Tell them the Eagle has landed and he needs a ride home."